My name is Clara Whitmore, 72 years old, widow of Richard Whitmore, once the steady compass of my life. Now, just a silver-haired woman trying to keep her footing in a world that moves faster than she can walk. Today was supposed to be about my daughter, Lily. Her wedding in Charleston, South Carolina, a grand affair dripping with roses and champagne flutes tall enough to make you dizzy. Before I go on, if you're listening to this, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, share this story, and drop a comment about where you're watching from. Stories like mine don't just happen in books. They happen to people you know. Maybe even someone in your family. I stepped into the historic church reception hall, leaning heavily on my cane. The polished wooden floor creaked under my shoes, scuffed, worn-out flats I'd kept for too many years. My dress was a tired gray, the hem slightly frayed, and the pearl earrings dangling from my lobes were the last respectable thing I had left from Richard's mother. My hair, twisted in a loose bun, had started to slip, strands falling over my cheek. I let it be. Looking a little frail, a little out of place, suited me just fine. "Mom, you made it," Lily whispered, already distracted by the wedding coordinator frantically waving a clipboard. She kissed my cheek quickly, barely meeting my eyes. "You look radiant, sweetheart," I told her, watching the lace of her gown shimmer beneath the chandeliers. She smiled vaguely, the way brides do when they're already pulled in 10 directions at once. The usher checked my name on his list and guided me with polite efficiency. "Table 12, Mrs. Whitmore, right this way." I followed, cane tapping against the floor until I realized where he was taking me. Behind a towering floral arrangement so large it could have hidden a marching band. Lilies, hydrangeas, and a plume of roses rose up like a fortress, blocking my view of the bride and groom. "Excuse me," I said softly, tilting my head. "Is there perhaps another seat available? I'd love to see my daughter on her big day." The usher gave me a tight smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am, the seating chart is quite fixed." And so, I shuffled into exile behind the flowers, my cane bumping the table leg as if to punctuate the insult. From here, I could watch the room only by glancing into the mirror across the wall, my reflection reduced to a shadow surrounded by petals. I took a slow breath, forcing my lips into a gentle smile. They think they've tucked me away, harmless and forgotten. That's fine. A widow who looks fragile is the last person anyone bothers to watch carefully. At the table beside me, 2 women in sequined gowns glanced over, whispering. "Poor thing," one murmured. "She looks like she could barely afford the cab ride here." I bent to pick up my handkerchief, deliberately letting it slip from my lap, fingers trembling slightly as if even that small task required effort. When I straightened, they quickly looked away, embarrassed. Good. Let them believe I was pitiful. The weaker I appeared, the more they would underestimate me. And underestimation has always been the sharpest weapon in my arsenal. The music swelled, and everyone turned to watch Lily and her new husband, Ethan Caldwell, enter the hall. Ethan's smile gleamed brighter than the chandelier, his tuxedo cut to perfection, his posture screaming confidence. He kissed Lily's hand with exaggerated charm, then began shaking hands with guests, slipping into conversations with ease. My eyes narrowed. His charm was polished, rehearsed. I'd seen that smile before. On men who could sell you a leaking roof and convince you it was a swimming pool. When he finally approached me, I expected a perfunctory nod. Instead, Ethan leaned down, voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, taking my hand firmly. "It's so important we talk soon. With Richard gone, I know managing finances can be overwhelming. I'd love to help consolidate everything, make sure your assets are protected for the future." A hush fell around us. Nearby guests raised their brows. Some even leaned in. I smiled weakly, tilting my head. "That's very considerate, Ethan." My voice trembled, sugar-coated and fragile, as if I barely understood what he meant. But inside, My pulse sharpened. This wasn't just a charming son-in-law. This was a man planting his flag on my territory in front of witnesses. He wanted everyone to see him as the savior of the helpless widow. Ethan straightened, still smiling, and gestured toward a man in a dark suit hovering by the door. "That's Daniel Morris, my attorney. He's already prepared a few things we could review next week. Just routine documents, nothing dramatic. Of course, at your pace." A few people clapped him on the back, nodding in admiration. "What a thoughtful young man," someone muttered. I folded my napkin, laying it neatly on my lap, masking the fire in my chest. So this is how he plays. Bold, public, like I'm already incapable of managing my own life. Ethan bent lower, whispering just for me. "Don't worry, Clara. I'll take care of you." I met his eyes, soft smile unchanging, though my grip on my cane tightened until my knuckles whitened. "Of course, dear," I whispered back. "I'm sure you will." As the room broke into applause for the couple's first dance, I stayed seated in my little corner of exile, eyes fixed on Ethan's reflection in the mirror. He thought he was stepping into an easy inheritance, a fragile widow too frail to fight back. What he didn't know was that this performance of weakness was deliberate. And one day soon, the man who pitied me most would learn the hard way that sometimes the prey has sharper teeth than the predator. The applause for the first dance had barely died down when I saw Ethan moving from guest to guest with the polish of a seasoned politician. My mirror on the far wall gave me a panoramic view of his performance. He wore that dazzling grin, perfect teeth, dimples at the ready. And each time he shifted from one cluster of guests to the next, his face changed ever so slightly. For the bankers at table 6, he leaned in with talk of markets and strategic partnerships. For Lily's college friends, he cracked jokes about their dorm years as though he'd been there himself. But when an elderly aunt asked about his plans for the honeymoon, his expression froze for a fraction of a second before he smoothed it over with exaggerated charm. It wasn't just a smile, it was a mask. And I'd spent a lifetime learning to read masks. I dabbed the corner of my lips with my napkin, leaning on my cane, as though rising might take all the strength I had. "Mrs. Whitmore," came his voice, suddenly close. Ethan had slipped into the empty chair beside me, his cologne crisp, almost clinical. He didn't bother lowering his tone. People nearby could hear every word. "Isn't this magical?" he said, gesturing toward the glittering hall as if he were presenting me with a prize he'd won himself. "You must be bursting with pride tonight." My smile was sugar-sweet. "Oh, I'm practically vibrating with maternal joy," I replied. "Although I confess, the view from here is instructive." His grin faltered for half a heartbeat before returning to full wattage. "That's wonderful. You know, Clara, I'd really like us to spend some proper time together soon. Get to know each other, beyond the wedding chaos." "Most families do that before the vows," I said lightly. "But I admire your unconventional approach." This time, the pause in his smile was unmistakable, a flicker caught only by those trained to watch for cracks. He recovered quickly. "Dinner this week? Just the two of us. I have some ideas about family collaboration." I tilted my head. "Family collaboration? How ominous. Thursday, perhaps?" "Perfect," he said. His tone was warm, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the man he'd introduced earlier. Daniel, the attorney. They exchanged the slightest nod, like a pair of gamblers signaling the next round. As the band struck up a jazz number, Lily twirled across the floor, glowing in her lace gown. My heart softened at the sight of her joy, but it tightened again when I caught Ethan watching me in the mirror, his smile gone, his face calculating. He leaned closer, lowering his voice this time. "You'll see, Clara. Things are about to get easier for you." I turned my cane over in my lap, fingers drumming lightly on the curved handle. "I've managed 72 years without collapsing. But I'll look forward to your definition of easier." Later, during the bouquet toss, I slipped toward the powder room, letting the echo of laughter fade behind me. Inside the marble sanctuary, I steadied myself in the mirror. The woman staring back looked every inch the role I'd chosen. Frail, modest, nearly invisible. I adjusted a strand of hair so it fell against my cheek, softening the angles of my face. Then I practiced my harmless smile. The one that said, I wouldn't know a contract from a crossword puzzle. When I returned to my floral fortress, Ethan was charming the Hendersons, an elderly couple who once worked with Richard at his law firm. They were laughing, nearly swooning, as Ethan clasped Mr. Henderson's hand like a long-lost confidant. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said brightly, catching my eye as if I were part of the performance. "Really looking forward to Thursday." "So am I, dear," I said, lowering myself back into my chair. "So am I." The night wound down in a flurry of champagne toasts and clinking silverware. From my corner, I watched Ethan glide through the crowd with the efficiency of a shark in calm water. Lily followed him with shining eyes, oblivious to the undercurrent that pulled at everything he touched. To the guests, Ethan looked like a man stepping confidently into family life, eager to shoulder responsibility. But to me, every gesture screamed calculation. He wasn't joining the family. He was positioning himself to own it. As I gathered my shawl and leaned on my cane to rise, I let my eyes linger on his reflection in the mirror one last time. Ethan Caldwell believed he had married into wealth. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that this fragile widow had been playing a longer, sharper game than he could ever conceive. And come Thursday, at that quiet dinner he thought would seal his control, he'd begin to understand just how dangerous underestimation could be. By Thursday evening, Savannah's historic district was wrapped in a humid twilight, the kind that clung to your skin like a warning. I'd spent most of the day dusting Richard's old books and deadheading roses, small rituals to steady my hands. But beneath the calm surface, my chest thudded with anticipation. Ethan thought tonight was his moment to tighten the leash. What he didn't know was that every leash has two ends. The restaurant he chose sat on a corner lined with gas lamps, the kind of place where they whispered water like it had an accent, and the wine list looked longer than the Bible. I arrived in my black dress, simple, modest, not a hint of prosperity. A broken watch of Richard's dangled from my wrist, its face frozen in time, a deliberate choice. Appearances matter, especially when you want to be underestimated. Ethan was already seated, posture impeccable, his suit tailored within an inch of perfection. He rose quickly, pulling out my chair as though chivalry were second nature. "Clara, you look absolutely radiant tonight." I smiled faintly, settling into the chair with a soft thump of my cane. "Thank you, dear. This place certainly is something." The waiter approached with a bottle of red Ethan had clearly rehearsed pronouncing. He swirled it dramatically before tasting. "Exquisite," he declared, as if he'd grown up in French vineyards instead of suburban Georgia. I let him bask in the performance, then I folded my hands on the table. "So, Ethan, what is it you're so eager to discuss?" He leaned in, lowering his voice to that confidential tone men use when they think they're about to save you from yourself. "I've been thinking about you, about your situation. Living alone, that big house, all the decisions you have to make. It must be overwhelming." I tilted my head, eyes warm. "Overwhelming?" At my age, the hardest decision I face most mornings is whether to put sugar in my coffee. I've managed. He chuckled, that hollow boardroom laugh designed to flatter investors. Of course. But Clara, you're vulnerable. People take advantage. Unscrupulous contractors, shady advisors, even relatives who suddenly become very interested in your welfare." There it was, the first card on the table. "How thoughtful of you," I murmured. "And what exactly do you suggest?" With a flourish, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim manila folder. He placed it between us like a magician revealing the final act. "Protective paperwork. Just safeguards, really. Nothing dramatic." Power of attorney, financial oversight, medical authority, meant to ensure you're always protected. I brushed my fingers across the folder, as though it might bite. This is comprehensive. My attorney specializes in elder care, he said smoothly. He's handled many cases like yours. My case? I asked, raising an eyebrow. As if widowhood were a rare disease? Ethan's jaw tightened, but he smiled again. I just want you to feel secure. Lily agrees it's brilliant. The words landed like a stone. Lily agrees. My daughter, swept up in the illusion of Ethan's devotion, already convinced her mother needed rescuing. I opened the folder, pages rustling like dry leaves. The words blurred together. Durable power of attorney. Irrevocable authority. Consent to medical decisions. Legal chains disguised as kindness. And this needs to be handled quickly? I asked, voice airy. Timing matters, he said firmly. The longer you wait, the more questions could arise about your capacity to make such decisions. Capacity. The way he said it chilled me. He was laying groundwork to declare me incompetent before I even dropped my cane. I closed the folder gently, resting my hands on top of it. This certainly requires careful thought. Perhaps I should review it with my own attorney. His smile flickered. Your own lawyer? Oh yes, I know it seems silly, but I'd feel more comfortable if someone explained it in terms my simple mind could grasp. Clara, he said, leaning forward, voice sharpening. We should finalize this tonight. These matters work best when handled efficiently. I sipped my wine, letting it roll across my tongue. Important decisions shouldn't be rushed, Ethan. Surely you agree? He inhaled slowly, clearly recalibrating. Of course. Take all the time you need. But please, don't delay too long. It would be such a shame if circumstances complicated things. I let silence stretch between us, the clink of silverware from other tables filling the space. His mask was slipping, if only by millimeters, and behind it, I glimpsed the hunger. At last, I smiled sweetly, the way you do to a child caught with a hand in the cookie jar. How thoughtful you are, dear. Protecting me from dangers I hadn't even imagined. I'll consider it carefully. Relief washed over his face, but his eyes stayed hard, calculating. He believed he'd nudged me onto his path. He had no idea I'd been laying stones on my own path for weeks. When we stood to leave, Ethan took my elbow with just enough pressure to remind me who he thought held control. I let my hand tremble against his arm, cane tapping softly on the marble floor. The performance was nearly flawless. Outside, the night air carried the scent of magnolia and the distant roll of the river. Ethan pressed the folder into my hand. Read it tonight. We'll talk again soon. I nodded, tucking it under my arm as though it were too heavy to carry. Yes, Ethan. We'll talk again very soon. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that by the time our next conversation came, I would no longer be playing the helpless widow. The manila folder still sat on my kitchen table the next morning, its edges crisp, its contents poisonous. I'd left it there overnight, untouched, while I slept in Richard's armchair with the lamp on. Every time I opened my eyes, I could see Ethan's confident smirk hovering in the dim light, as if he were already inside my house, rearranging my life. By Saturday, the calls began. First, Lily's cheerful voice on speakerphone. Mom, did Ethan give you the paperwork? Isn't it wonderful how thoughtful he is? He just wants you safe. I pressed the phone closer, letting my silence linger. Yes, darling, he's certainly thorough. You're considering it, right? It would mean so much to him. So much to him. Not to her. My daughter was already echoing his script, word for word. By Monday, Ethan called directly. His tone was smooth, rehearsed. Clara, I hope you've had time to review everything. These documents are really just common sense. I'd love to go over them again, maybe somewhere quieter. How about your place? Wednesday evening? My home? I asked, letting my voice flutter with surprise. Of course. More comfortable for you. I can bring additional examples. Families who benefited from similar arrangements. I think it'll help ease your mind. Families. Benefited. His euphemisms tasted like ash. I suppose that could work, I said softly. 7 o'clock? Perfect, he replied, and though his voice stayed polished, I caught the eagerness beneath it, like static on the line. When I hung up, my fingers were trembling, but not from fear, from adrenaline. If Ethan wanted to step onto my stage, I'd be ready with the spotlight. That evening, I rang Janet Ross, Richard's old attorney, and the one name he'd told me never to forget. Janet had been with me through the funeral, the estate filings, even the endless phone calls about taxes I didn't understand. She had a face like granite and eyes sharp enough to cut through pretense. Janet, I said, I think it's time you earned that retainer Richard insisted I keep paying. What's happened? So I told her everything. The wedding humiliation, the dinner with its poisoned wine, the folder on my table, Ethan's sudden urgency. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, he's accelerating the timeline. Predators always do when they sense opportunity. You need to be careful. Careful is my middle name, I said, though my hand on the receiver was slick with sweat. But I don't want just careful, Janet. I want prepared. Her tone shifted. Do you want me there Wednesday? No, I said firmly. He can't know I've got help. Not yet. But I need you on standby. And I need options. The next day, I went through the house like a soldier mapping terrain. The living room, where Richard's grandfather clock ticked like a heartbeat, would be the battleground. I dusted the coffee table, rearranged the lamps, checked the blinds. Then I set up a small camera, hidden inside a porcelain vase Richard's sister had given us decades ago. Another nestled on the bookshelf, between dusty law volumes he'd once studied for fun. When I crouched to plug in the recorder beneath the sofa, I whispered aloud, You wanted me safe, Richard. Well, I'm going to be more than safe. I'm going to be dangerous. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper by the time I finished. It no longer felt like a home. It felt like a trap. On Tuesday evening, Lily stopped by, carrying leftover cake from the wedding. She placed it on the counter, her eyes searching mine. Mom, Ethan told me he's meeting you tomorrow. Please don't be difficult. He's just trying to make things easier. Easier for whom? I asked. For everyone. She hesitated, then added in a whisper. You know, sometimes you sound suspicious, like you don't trust him. He loves me, Mom. Why can't you accept that? Her words sliced deeper than she knew. I wanted to grab her shoulders and shake sense into her, but I only rested my hand lightly on hers. Lily, darling, trust is a fragile thing. It takes years to build, seconds to lose, and sometimes the people who say they love you most are the ones you should watch the closest. She pulled back, frowning. You're overthinking. Just, please, don't make him feel unwelcome tomorrow. I wouldn't dream of it, I said, voice syrup sweet. But inside, I was already counting down the hours. By Wednesday morning, the tension in my chest was coiled tight enough to snap. The folder still sat on my table, a snake waiting to strike. But now, next to it, lay something else. My own notes. Questions written in neat script. Where did you work before? How many families have you helped? What debts are you hiding? All designed to push, to probe, to expose. The phone rang at noon. Ethan's voice purred through the line. Clara, I'm bringing a few additional documents tonight. Success stories, you could call them. They'll show you how much peace of mind this can bring. How thoughtful, I said, and let my voice crackle with just enough frailty to keep him comfortable. When I hung up, I stood at the window, watching the river wind its way through Savannah. My reflection in the glass looked small, stooped, Kane leaning by the chair. But beneath that image was something else, a glimmer of steel. He thought he was coming to coax a helpless widow into surrender. What he didn't realize was that by stepping into my house, Ethan Caldwell was about to walk straight into a battlefield I'd been preparing for days. Wednesday evening arrived draped in shadows, the kind that settle early in Savannah when the air is heavy with rain that never quite falls. I'd polished the house until it gleamed, not for his sake, but for mine. Every lamp was set to a low glow, warm enough to feel inviting, but sharp enough to record every twitch of his face on the hidden cameras. At precisely 7, a knock rattled the front door. My pulse quickened. I steadied myself on the cane, breathed once, then opened it. Ethan stood there, briefcase in one hand, smile rehearsed to perfection. Behind him hovered a notary, a pale young man clutching a leather folio, eyes darting nervously as though he already sensed this evening would not end well. "Clara," Ethan said, stepping inside with the confidence of someone who believed he already owned the place. "Thank you for having us. I know this can feel overwhelming." "Oh, I'm not overwhelmed at all," I said softly, motioning toward the living room. "I'm finding it educational." He laughed politely, guiding the notary to a seat before laying his briefcase on my coffee table. Papers spilled out in practice stacks, spreading across the polished wood like a battle map. "Now," he began, flipping open the top folder. "I've brought case studies, families who've thrived because someone stepped in early. I think you'll find them reassuring." "How thoughtful," I murmured, lowering myself into the armchair opposite. My cane leaned against the side, close enough to grab. Ethan straightened the papers, his voice dropping into that confidential register again. "Clara, this is really about protecting you, ensuring you never have to worry about decisions that could be too much. You've carried enough." I studied him, letting silence linger until he fidgeted. Then I asked, "And what qualifies you, Ethan? What background do you have for managing other people's lives?" He blinked, caught off guard. "Well, I have extensive business experience." "In what field?" "Investment management, mostly." "For which firm?" His jaw tightened. "I work independently now. Before that, various positions in financial services." "Various?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "How delightfully vague." The notary shifted uncomfortably. Ethan forced another smile. "The point is, I know how complicated things can become for someone in your position." "And what position would that be exactly?" "A widow," he said flatly. Then quickly, "I mean, someone without a partner to share the burden." My fingers tapped the armrest. "Tell me, Ethan, how many elderly people have you protected?" "A few," he said carefully. "Families who needed guidance." "Guidance they requested, or guidance you suggested they needed?" The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Richard's grandfather clock. For the first time, Ethan's mask slipped, a flicker of irritation flashing in his eyes. "Clara," he said tightly, "you're misunderstanding my intentions." "Oh, I understand them perfectly," I said, leaning forward, my voice sharpening. "What I'm curious about is your methods." His hand slammed the table, rattling the porcelain vase above the hidden camera. The notary jumped. "My methods," Ethan hissed, "are about keeping this family safe. You're too stubborn to admit you need help. Do you want to end up alone, broke, and confused while predators pick you clean?" I met his glare with a calm so steady it surprised even me. "Funny, from where I'm sitting, the only predator in this room is you." Color rose in his cheeks. He shoved the folder toward me, pages sliding across my lap. "Sign them, tonight, or you'll regret it." I let my hands tremble as though I might obey. Then I placed the papers back on the table with deliberate care. "Ethan, dear, threats don't become you. They wrinkle that handsome facade you've worked so hard to polish. Sign them!" His voice cracked, louder now, fist clenching the edge of my chair. His other hand grabbed my wrist, grip firm enough to leave bruises. The notary half rose from his seat, unsure whether to intervene. I looked up at Ethan, my voice dropping to a whisper sharp as glass. "You've made a mistake, boy. You thought I was prey." His breath caught. And that's when the front door burst open. "Savannah Police, don't move!" Uniformed officers surged into the room, weapons drawn but steady. Ethan froze, his hands still locked on my wrist, eyes wide with disbelief. I pulled free, smoothing my sleeve. "Gentlemen, you're right on time." "What the hell is this?" Ethan sputtered as two officers seized his arms, yanking them behind his back. "This is entrapment. You can't—" "You'd be amazed what we can do," one officer muttered, snapping cuffs around his wrists. The notary bolted upright, babbling. "I didn't know. I was just here to notarize. I swear I didn't know." "Relax," I told him calmly. "You'll be giving a very helpful statement." Ethan twisted in the officer's grip, desperation spilling from his voice. "Clara, think about Lily. Think about what this will do to her. You're destroying your own daughter's happiness." I stood slowly, leaning on my cane with practiced grace. "No, Ethan. You destroyed it the moment you decided to hunt her mother." As they dragged him toward the door, he spat over his shoulder. "This isn't over!" "Yes," I said, my voice steady, echoing through the hallway as the cuffs clicked shut. "It is!" When the house fell quiet again, I sank back into Richard's armchair. My hands still shook, not from fear this time, but from release. I looked around the living room, the papers scattered, the vase steady once more on the mantel. The battle was over. But the war? That was only beginning. The silence after Ethan's arrest was deafening. My living room, once buzzing with police radios and the scrape of cuffs, now sat in eerie stillness. The papers he'd forced on me were still strewn across the coffee table like broken promises. I lowered myself into Richard's old armchair, cane leaning against the side. For a moment, I let the quiet swallow me whole. My pulse was still erratic, but not from fear, from anticipation. Because tonight, for the first time in 2 years, I was ready to face the thing I'd avoided since Richard's funeral. The locked door at the bottom of the basement stairs. I stood, steadying myself. The house creaked as I moved down the hallway, past the photographs of a younger me and Richard, all smiles and pressed suits. He'd always seemed so ordinary, too ordinary perhaps, now that I thought about it. The basement door groaned when I pushed it open. The smell of old paper and cedar hit me immediately, mixed faintly with Richard's cologne still clinging to his coats left hanging on the hook. I flicked the light switch, and the single bulb overhead sputtered to life, throwing a weak glow over the concrete walls. Against one wall sat his desk. Piles of crossword puzzles, coffee-stained coasters, the reading glasses he'd worn for 40 years. And just behind it, flush with the wall, a panel I'd never noticed before. My breath caught as I ran my fingers across it. The panel shifted under pressure, revealing a small safe, its metal face worn smooth. My hands shook as I slid the key, the one he'd left in his dresser drawer, into the lock. It turned with a click that echoed like thunder in the small room. Inside were neat stacks of documents, envelopes, and something I didn't expect. A slim black flash drive and a folded note with my name in Richard's handwriting. My knees nearly gave out. I sank into his chair, holding the note like a relic. "Clara, if you're reading this, it means someone has tried to take from you what I spent 40 years building. I'm sorry for the secrecy. I needed you safe. Play the video first." With trembling hands, I climbed the stairs, found Richard's old laptop, and slid the flash drive into place. The screen flickered. Then there he was. Richard, alive, smiling faintly, eyes twinkling as though he'd just come in from the garden. "My Clara?" His voice filled the room, rich and steady. I pressed a hand to my mouth. "If you're watching this, then my worst prediction has come true. Someone has targeted you, probably through family. Don't panic. I prepared for this. For you." He leaned closer to the camera, lowering his voice. "I never told you everything about our money. Because it wasn't just a nest egg. It was a storm shelter. I lived modestly so no one would suspect. But I made investments, early, risky, in places no one expected an old lawyer to touch. A startup in California, a biotech firm in Boston, even a digital art collection before people knew what that meant. They paid off, Clara. They paid off big. He paused, lips trembling with an almost guilty smile. There's $35 million in trust accounts, completely protected. Yours, no one else's. I didn't tell you sooner because grief is dangerous. I didn't want you making choices out of pain. But now, if someone's come sniffing, it's time to use it. Use every penny if you must. Make them regret the day they thought you were weak. The screen froze on his face, then went black. I sat there, sobbing quietly into my palms. $35 million. More money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But it wasn't the money that broke me. It was the sound of his voice, the way he'd looked at me through the lens, as if he were still alive, still shielding me. I whispered into the empty room. Oh, Richard, you knew this would happen. When the tears dried, I turned back to the safe, rifling through the documents. Bank statements from accounts I'd never seen. Legal protections layered so thick, even Ethan's slickest lawyer couldn't pierce them. And at the very bottom, a business card. Janet Ross, attorney at law. On the back, in Richard's handwriting, she knows everything. Trust her. The next morning, I dialed Janet's office. She picked up on the second ring. Ross and Whitmore, she said crisply. Janet, I whispered. It's Clara. I found it. All of it. Her tone softened instantly. He told me you'd call when the time was right. How soon can you come in? How soon do you want me? Now. Bring the documents. Bring everything. The drive into downtown Savannah was a blur of magnolia trees and iron gates. Janet's office sat in a renovated brick townhouse, warm light spilling from its tall windows. She greeted me at the door with a firm handshake, ushering me past walls lined with law degrees and family photographs. We spread Richard's files across her mahogany desk. She scanned them with quick, practiced eyes, nodding with admiration. Clara, your husband was brilliant. He didn't just build wealth, he built armor, an irrevocable trust. No power of attorney can override it. Even if you'd signed Ethan's papers, he wouldn't have touched a cent. Relief surged through me so sharp it made me dizzy. So Ethan never had a chance? Not legally, Janet said. Her lips curved into something fierce. But that doesn't mean we let him walk away. We're going to make him pay for trying. I leaned back, gripping the arms of my chair. What do you mean? We file criminal charges, attempted fraud, elder exploitation, and we dig. Men like Ethan never act alone. If he's desperate enough to come after you, he's desperate enough to be part of a network. We expose him. We expose them all. I looked down at Richard's papers, then back at Janet. For the first time since his death, I didn't feel like a widow fumbling in the dark. I felt like a woman standing at the threshold of a war my husband had armed me for. I gathered the files into a neat stack, my hands no longer shaking. All right, I said quietly, but firmly. Let's make him regret it. By the time I got home from Janet's office, dusk had rolled over Savannah, painting the streets in copper shadows. My mind buzzed with Richard's video, the weight of his words pressing heavier than the fortune he'd left me. $35 million. Protected. Waiting. And now, a weapon. But I barely had time to take off my shawl before the front door burst open. Mom! Lily stormed inside, her heels striking the hardwood like gunfire. Her eyes were red, her mascara smudged, but her fury burned brighter than her grief. She slammed the door so hard the grandfather clock rattled. What have you done to Ethan? She demanded, her voice cracking but fierce. I steadied myself against the armchair, cane in hand. I protected myself, Lily. Something you should be grateful for. Grateful? Her laugh was sharp, bitter. You had him arrested in front of everyone. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? For me? I drew a breath, forcing calm into my tone. Humiliation is a small price to pay for truth. She threw her purse onto the couch, pacing like a caged animal. You don't understand him. He was trying to help you. He wanted to make sure you were taken care of. But no, you twist everything. You can't stand to see me happy, can you? The words cut deeper than she knew, but I didn't flinch. Lily, sit down. Please. There are things you don't know. Things Richard knew would happen. Don't bring Dad into this, she snapped, her voice trembling. He's gone, and now you're trying to drag Ethan down with your paranoia. God, Mom, you're acting crazy. That last word, crazy, hung between us like a knife. I tightened my grip on the cane, the old wood biting into my palm. Do you really think I'd orchestrate something like this out of jealousy? Out of boredom? I've lived long enough to recognize a predator when I see one. She stopped pacing, her chest heaving. He loves me, she whispered, and for the first time her voice cracked with desperation. He chose me, and you just can't stand not being in control. I stepped closer, letting her see the steel in my eyes. He chose my bank account, Lily. He chose my vulnerability. And when that didn't work, he tried to break me into signing it all away. Is that love? Her lips trembled, but she shook her head violently. No, you're lying. You've always had a problem with the men I love. Always too protective, always interfering. Maybe you want me alone and miserable like you. Her words hit harder than Ethan's threats ever had. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sting settle. When I opened them, my voice was steady, but low. You think I'm miserable? You think Richard would want his daughter so blinded by flattery that she can't see the con standing in front of her? She crossed her arms, chin high, like a child daring me to strike. Show me proof. If you're so sure, prove to me Ethan's a monster. Because until I see it with my own eyes, I won't believe you. I stared at her, my heart breaking even as anger flared. Be careful what you ask for, Lily. Proof can destroy more than illusions. It can shatter everything you thought was real. Then shatter it, she said, her jaw clenched. Or admit you're wrong. I moved to the sideboard where I'd hidden the small recorder Janet had given me. My fingers hovered over it. The urge to shield her was strong, to protect her from the sound of Ethan's voice dripping venom. But I remembered Richard's message. Make them regret the day they underestimated you. I pressed play. Ethan's voice filled the room, smooth at first, then sharp with impatience. Sign them, tonight, or you'll regret it. Then the slam of his fist on my table. The threat in his whisper. You don't want to end up alone, broke, and confused while predators pick you clean. Lily's hands flew to her mouth. No, that can't be him. The recording continued, Ethan's voice cracking with anger. Sign them, or I'll make sure no one believes you can make decisions for yourself. I stopped the tape. The room was so quiet I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock again. Tears welled in her eyes, but she shook her head violently. He was upset. People say things when they're upset. It means exactly what it sounds like, I said, stepping closer, voice raw. He was going to strip me of my independence, put me in a nursing home, and take everything Richard left us. Everything! Her sob broke free, jagged and loud. She turned away, pressing her forehead to the wall as if she could disappear inside it. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse. How could I be so blind? I reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. For a moment, she didn't move. Then slowly, she let her head fall against me, her tears dampening my blouse. Because he was good at it, I whispered into her hair. Because people like Ethan survive by making good people doubt themselves. It's not your fault. But even as I held her, my mind was already shifting. If Ethan had fooled Lily this completely, how many others had he conned? And what would they do when they realized their charming protege was in handcuffs? Lily pulled back, her eyes swollen, but a new hardness flickering in them. What happens now, Mom? I brushed a strand of hair from her face. Now we make sure Ethan Caldwell never does this to anyone else again. The morning after Lily broke down in my arms, the phone calls began. Reporters sniffing around like vultures, neighbors whispering on porches, and the courthouse clerk confirming Ethan's arraignment for the following week. I'd spent a lifetime avoiding spectacle, but suddenly, my private war had spilled into the streets of Savannah. Lily sat at my kitchen table, pale and hollow-eyed, stirring a cup of coffee she never drank. She hadn't spoken much since the night I'd played her the recording. When the phone rang again, she flinched. "Don't answer," she whispered. I picked it up anyway. Janet's voice came sharp and steady. "Clara, the DA wants to meet today. They're considering charging Ethan with attempted fraud and elder exploitation. We need to get ahead of his defense before he spins this as a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. My knuckles whitened around the receiver. "Set the time. I'll be there." The district attorney's office was a brick building with the weight of history pressing down on its steps. Inside, the air hummed with fluorescent lights and urgency. Janet walked beside me, her heels clicking like gunshots, her briefcase swinging with quiet authority. In a conference room, D.A. Mitchell, a lean woman with iron gray hair, sat with a stack of folders. She slid one toward me. Inside were photos. Ethan at my table, papers spread, his hand gripping my wrist. Still shots pulled from the hidden cameras I'd planted. "Mrs. Hale?" she said, her tone formal but respectful. "This is textbook exploitation. He'll argue you misunderstood his intentions, that you were confused. But the recording and these images tell another story." I nodded slowly. "He underestimated me. That's his only mistake." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "It's a big one. But his lawyers are already circling. They'll claim entrapment, family misunderstanding, even diminished responsibility." Janet cut in, her voice crisp. "But we'll push for attempted fraud, coercion, and intent to defraud an elder. We've got her testimony, the recording, the physical aggression. It's airtight." Mitchell looked at me. "The stronger your voice, the better. Are you prepared to testify?" I straightened in my chair. I've been preparing for this since the night Richard died. That night, word spread faster than wildfire. The local news ran the headline, "Prominent Savannah man arrested in elder exploitation sting." Ethan's mugshot stared out from the screen, his polished smile stripped away, replaced with hollow-eyed rage. The phone rang again. This time, Patricia Caldwell, his mother. Her voice dripped with indignation. "Clara, how dare you drag our family name through the mud? Ethan was only trying to help. You've destroyed his career, his reputation." "Patricia," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "Your son tried to steal my life. He would have put me in a nursing home and drained every account I had. Do you want me to play the recording for you?" There was a pause, then her icy retort. "You'll regret this vendetta. Families survive scandals, but bitterness eats you alive." I hung up before she could say more. Lily's reaction to the news coverage was worse. She paced the living room, hair falling from its bun, eyes wild. "They're saying he targeted other women, Mom, that he's done this before. That can't be true." "It can," I said softly, "and it is. But I loved him." "I know." I reached for her hand. She let me take it this time, though her grip was weak. "And love makes us blind. But now we see clearly, and clarity is power." The arraignment came on Monday. The courthouse was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing like lightning storms. I walked past them slowly, Kane tapping against the marble steps, holding my head high. Inside, Ethan sat at the defense table in an immaculate suit, but his face was gaunt, his charm eroded by days in a cell. When his eyes found mine, they burned with hatred. The judge read the charges. Attempted fraud, coercion, elder exploitation. Ethan's lawyer leapt to his feet. Your Honor, this is a family dispute blown wildly out of proportion. My client was merely trying to protect his mother-in-law. Protect? I barked out a laugh from my seat behind Janet. The sound startled the room. Ethan flinched. The judge silenced me with a glance, but I didn't care. Let them see I wasn't afraid. Afterward, outside the courthouse, reporters crowded close. Mrs. Hale, are you seeking restitution? Mrs. Hale, do you regret pressing charges? Mrs. Hale, do you believe Ethan Caldwell truly loves your daughter? I stopped, the sun blazing hot against my back, and faced the cameras. My late husband built his life on integrity. He taught me that predators survive only when good people stay silent. Ethan Caldwell chose the wrong widow to underestimate, and I will not be silent. The crowd erupted in questions, but I kept walking, Kane steady against the pavement. That evening, Janet called with news. The DA is considering expanding the case. Ethan's financial records show suspicious transactions, gambling debts, shell companies. If we trace them, we might uncover a network. A chill ran down my spine, the same chill I'd felt when Richard's video warned me of predators circling. Do it, I said. Expose them all. At home, I sat in Richard's chair, staring at his folded note. $35 million wasn't just money anymore. It was a war chest. And Ethan's downfall was only the first battle. The legal war had begun, and I was ready to fight it, Kane in one hand, Richard's legacy in the other. The courthouse lights still haunted me long after the crowd of reporters dispersed. That night, when the house finally grew quiet, I sat in Richard's chair with his note in my lap. Make them regret the day they thought you were weak. His words weren't just comfort anymore. They were instructions. Ethan was just one man. But Janet's research was already uncovering what Richard had warned me about. A network, shell companies, false trusts, and desperate predators circling like sharks. It wasn't enough to win my case. I needed to scorch the sea they swam in. 2 days later, Janet arranged another meeting at her office. This time, she wasn't alone. A young prosecutor named Sarah Torres joined us, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes sharp with determination. Mrs. Hale, Sarah said, sliding a thick folder across the table. Your case has opened doors we've been trying to kick down for years. Ethan isn't just a predator, he's connected. Gambling debts, laundering, maybe even interstate fraud. If we can prove it, we could dismantle an entire ring. My fingers brushed the folder, its weight heavier than paper. And you think Richard's money can help fund that fight? Sarah hesitated. Federal resources are thin, but with private backing, legal fees, investigators, we could move faster. We could set a precedent. I caught Janet's eye. She didn't flinch. Clara, this is bigger than Ethan now. You have the chance to turn Richard's foresight into something permanent. I leaned back, heart hammering. For 72 years, I had lived as the supporting character in other people's stories. Richard's wife, Lily's mother, the polite widow tucked behind a floral arrangement. Now, for the first time, I had the power to become the author. That evening, I told Lily. She was curled on my couch with a blanket, still pale from the blow of betrayal. They want me to fund a program, I began gently. A legal initiative to protect people like me, like Richard knew I would need. Her brow furrowed. Mom, that sounds huge and risky. Haven't you been through enough? Why can't you just enjoy Dad's money and rest? Because resting doesn't keep wolves from circling. My voice cracked, but I steadied it. Lily, I don't want to die knowing Ethan was only the first of many. If Richard gave me the tools to fight, then fighting is what I'll do. She hugged the blanket tighter, whispering, I feel so stupid. I let him into our lives. I almost defended him in court. I reached for her hand. No. He deceived you because you have a kind heart. That's what men like him exploit. But this, I tapped Richard's note. This is how we make sure no one else falls for the same lie. For the first time since Ethan's arrest, Lily looked at me with something other than pain. There was resolve in her eyes. Then do it. Build it. Just don't let him be the end of the story. Weeks passed in a blur of signatures, hearings, and interviews. The press labeled me the widow who fought back. Headlines screamed about predators caught in their own traps, about seniors no longer sitting quietly while their savings were siphoned away. At first, the attention felt invasive. But then letters began arriving. Shaky handwriting from women in Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas. I saw what you did. I wish I'd had your courage. My son-in-law did the same thing. Can you help me? Each letter poured gasoline on the fire Richard had lit in me. I told Janet, we're not just fighting cases. We're building a shield, something bigger than me, bigger than Savannah. She smiled, fierce and proud. Then let's give it a name. The first time I saw it printed in bold across a legal draft, my breath caught. The Widow's Fang Initiative. It was raw, unapologetic, almost violent. Exactly what I wanted predators to feel when they heard it. Fear. The program launched with federal cooperation. My initial donation of $5 million funded investigators, attorneys, and victim support centers. Within 3 months, they'd already identified 12 ongoing fraud schemes targeting elderly women. Arrests followed. And with every handcuff snapped shut, I felt Richard's presence beside me. One evening, Sarah called with an update. Clara, the FBI has flagged Ethan's contacts. We're talking dozens of victims. This initiative, your initiative, is giving us leverage we never had before. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone. Then make sure they all fall. Every last one. After I hung up, I stepped onto my porch, the Savannah night thick with jasmine. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt more alive than broken. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about legacy. My legacy. Weeks later, at a press conference, I stood behind a podium, my cane steady against the wood. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned in. 2 months ago, I began, my son-in-law tried to steal not just my money, but my independence. He failed. What he didn't know was that my husband left me more than wealth. He left me a mission. Today, that mission is a national program dedicated to protecting the vulnerable and punishing those who exploit them. Let this be a warning. Widows bite back, and some of us bite hard. The room erupted in questions, but I held my ground, smiling faintly. Richard had armed me. Ethan had provoked me. And now, the Widow's Fang Initiative would outlive us all. The autumn sun spilled gold across the steps of Savannah's Civic Hall as I walked toward the podium, cane steady, daughter at my side. The Widow's Fang Initiative had grown faster than anyone predicted. Arrests across 6 states, millions recovered for victims, and, most surprisingly, a groundswell of voices calling me a hero. I never asked for that word, but I could feel the weight of it in every handshake, every tearful thank you letter. Inside, the room was filled with faces. Survivors, officials, neighbors who once whispered but now stood in applause. At the front row, Lily sat straighter than I'd seen in months, her chin high. She had filed for divorce the week before. It had broken her, but it had also remade her. And in her eyes now, I saw Richard's stubborn fire. The mayor's voice echoed through the hall. Today, we recognize Clara Hale, whose courage has sparked a movement against exploitation. She reminds us all that resilience has no age, and that even in grief, there is power. Applause thundered as I stepped forward. I wasn't dressed in the gray wilted dresses they once used to hide me behind flowers. Instead, I wore deep navy silk and Richard's pearl earrings, my hair pinned with quiet pride. I leaned into the microphone. My voice, for once, didn't tremble. They thought I was too old, too weak, too alone to matter. They thought I'd sign away my independence like it was a formality. But here's the truth. Widows bite back. And when we do, we change the rules of the game. Gasps and applause rippled through the crowd. I raised my cane slightly, letting it gleam under the light like a sword disguised as wood. This cane is not a crutch. It is a reminder that strength can look fragile, but fragile things, when sharpened, can cut deepest. To every predator listening, stop underestimating us, because when you do, you create not victims, but warriors. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Even Lily, tears streaming, clapped until her hands reddened. For the first time in years, I felt Richard not as a ghost, but as a presence standing tall behind me, smiling his secret smile. That night, after the speeches, after the photographs and handshakes, Lily and I walked home through the quiet Savannah streets. She slipped her arm into mine. "Dad would be proud," she whispered. I squeezed her hand. "He already is." We walked in silence, the city lights glimmering like lanterns guiding us home. The fight wasn't over. But now, it was no longer mine alone. It belonged to every woman who refused to be silenced, every family who had suffered in shadows. Together, we had built something larger than revenge. We had built a legacy. When I look back on these past months, I see more than betrayal, more than the face of a man who tried to strip me of my dignity. I see a mirror, one that forced me to confront who I truly was. For years, I hid behind grief, behind gray dresses and quiet dinners, convincing myself that invisibility was safety. But safety built on silence is just another form of surrender. Richard knew that. That's why he left me not just money, but permission. Permission to rise, to fight, to turn pain into power. And what I've learned is this: we are never too old, too broken, or too small to matter. The moment we decide to stop being prey is the moment we begin to change the world. So if you're listening to my story, remember, your scars are not signs of weakness. They are maps, leading you towards strength you didn't know you had. Don't wait for someone else to fight your battles. Be dangerous in the best way possible. And if this story touched you, I ask one thing. Hit like, subscribe, share it with someone who needs courage tonight, and leave your story in the comments. Together, we're stronger. Together, we bite back.